The Shadow, the Darkness, by Thomas Ligotti. It seemed that Grossvogel was charging us entirely too much money for what he was offering. Some of us, we were about a dozen in all, blamed ourselves and our own idiocy as soon as we arrived in that place, which one neatly dressed old gentleman immediately dubbed the nucleus of nowhere. This same gentleman, who a few days before had announced to several persons his abandonment of poetry due to the lack of what he considered proper appreciation of his innovative practice of the hermetic lyric, went on to say that such a place as the one in which we found ourselves was exactly what we should have expected, and probably what we idiots and failures deserved. We had no reason to expect anything more, he explained, than to end up in the dead town of Crampton, in a nowhere region of the country, of the world in fact, during a dull season of the year that was pinched between such a lavish and brilliant autumn and what promised to be an equally lavish and brilliant winter time. We were trapped, he said, completely stranded for all practical purposes, in a region of the country and of the entire world, where all the manifestations of that bleak time of year, or rather its absence of manifestations, were so evident in the landscape around us, where everything was absolutely stripped to the bone, and where the pathetic emptiness of forms in their unadorned state was so brutally evident. When I pointed out that Grossvogel's brochure for this excursion, which he deemed a physical-metaphysical excursion, did not strictly misrepresent our destination, I received only evil looks from several of the others at the table where we sat, as well as from the nearby tables of the small, almost miniature diner in which the whole group of us were now packed, filling it to capacity with the presence of exotic out-of-towners, who, when they stopped bickering for a few moments, simply stared with a killing silence out the windows at the empty streets and broken-down buildings of the dead town of Crampton. The town was further maligned as a drab abyss, the speaker of this phrase being a skeletal individual who always introduced himself as a defrocked academic. This self-designation would usually provoke a query addressed to him, as to its meaning, after which he would, in so many words, elaborate on how his failure to skew his thinking to the standards of, as he termed it, the intellectual marketplace, along with his failure to conceal his unconventional studies and methodologies, had resulted in his long-time inability to secure a position within a reputable academic institution, or within any sort of institution or place of business whatever. Thus, in his mind, his failure was more or less his ultimate distinction, and in this sense he was typical of those of us who were seated at the few tables and upon stools along the counter of that miniature diner, complaining that Grossvogel had charged us entirely too much money, and to some degree misrepresented in his brochure the whole value and purpose of the excursion to the dead town of Crampton. Taking my copy of Grossvogel's brochure from the back pocket of my trousers, I unfolded its few pages and laid them out before the other three people, who were seated at the same table as I. Then I removed my fragile reading glasses from the pocket of the old cardigan I was wearing beneath my even older jacket, in order to scrutinize these pages once again, confirming the suspicions I had had about their meaning. "If you're looking for the fine print," said the man seated to my left, a photographic portraitist, who often broke into a spate of coughing whenever he began to speak, as he did on this occasion. "What I think my friend was going to say," said the man seated on my right, "was that we have been the victims of a subtle and intricate swindle. I say this on his behalf because this is the direction in which his mind works, am I right?" "A metaphysical swindle," confirmed the man on my left, who had ceased coughing for the moment. "Indeed, a metaphysical swindle," repeated the other man somewhat mockingly. "I would have never imagined myself being taken in by such a thing, given my experience and special field of knowledge. But this, of course, was such a subtle and intricate operation." Well, I knew that the man on my right was the author of an unpublished philosophical treatise entitled An Investigation into the Conspiracy Against the Human Race. I was not sure what he meant by the mention of his experience and special field of knowledge. Before I could inquire about this issue, I was brashly interrupted by the woman seated across the table from me. "Mr. Reiner Grossvogel is a fraud. It's as simple as that," she said, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "I've been aware of his fraudulent character for some time, as you know, even before his so-called metamorphic experience, or whatever he calls it." "Metamorphic recovery," I said by way of correction. "Fine, his metamorphic recovery, whatever that's supposed to mean. Even before that time I could see that he was somebody who had all the markings of a fraud. He only required the proper conjunction of circumstances to bring this trait out in him. And then along came that supposedly near-fatal illness of his that he says led to that. I can barely say it, metamorphic recovery. After that, he was able to realize all his unused talents for being the fraud he was always destined to be, and always wanted to be. I joined in this farcical excursion, or whatever it is, only for the satisfaction of seeing everyone else find out what I always knew, and always maintained about Reiner Grossvogel. You're all my witnesses, she finished, her wrinkled and heavily made-up eyes scanning our faces, and those of the others in the diner for the affirmation she sought. I knew this woman only by her professional name of Mrs. Angela. Until recently she had operated what everyone among our circle referred to as a psychic coffeehouse, which in addition to other goods and services, was known for its excellent pastries that she made herself, or at least claimed that she made, off the premises. Nevertheless, the business never seemed to prosper, either on the strength of its psychic readings, which were performed by several persons in Mrs. Angela's employ, or on the strength of its excellent pastries and somewhat overpriced coffee. It was Mrs. Angela who first complained about the quality of both the service and the modest fare being offered to us in the Crampton diner. Not long after we arrived that afternoon and immediately packed ourselves into what seemed to be the town's only active place of business, Mrs. Angela called out to the young woman whose lonely a task it was to cater to our group. "This coffee is incredibly bitter," she shouted at the girl, who was dressed in what appeared to be a brand-new white uniform. "And these donuts are stale, every one of them. What kind of place is this? I think this whole town and everything in it is a fraud." When the girl came over to our table and stood before us, I noticed that her uniform resembled that of a nurse more than it did an outfit worn by a waitress in a diner. Specifically, it reminded me of the uniforms that I saw worn by the nurses at the hospital where Grossvogel was treated for, and ultimately recovered from, what appeared at the time to be a very serious illness. While Mrs. Angela was berating the waitress over the quality of the coffee and donuts we'd been served, which were included in the travel package that Grossvogel's brochure described as the ultimate physical-metaphysical excursion, I was reviewing my memories of Grossvogel in that stark and conspicuously out-of-date hospital where he had been treated, however briefly some 2 years preceding our visit to the dead town of Crampton. He had been admitted to this wretched facility through its emergency room, which was simply the rear entrance to what was not so much a hospital, properly speaking, but more a makeshift clinic set up in an old building located in the decayed neighborhood where Grossvogel and most of those who knew him were forced to live due to our limited financial means. I myself was the one who took him, in a taxi, to this emergency room, and provided the woman at the admittance desk with all the pertinent information regarding Grossvogel, since he was in no condition to do so himself. Later, I explained to a nurse, whom I could not help looking upon as merely an emergency room attendant in a nurse's uniform, given that she seemed somehow lacking in medical expertise, that Grossvogel had collapsed at a local art gallery during a modest exhibit of his works. This was his first experience, I told the nurse, both as a publicly exhibited artist and as a victim of a sudden physical collapse. However, I did not mention that the art gallery to which I referred might have been more accurately depicted as an empty storefront that now and then was cleaned up and used for exhibitions or artistic performances of various types. Grossvogel had been complaining throughout the evening of abdominal pains, I informed the nurse, and then repeated to an emergency room physician, who also struck me as another medical attendant rather than as a legitimate doctor of medicine. The reason these abdominal pains had increased throughout the evening, I speculated to both the nurse and the doctor, was perhaps Grossvogel's increasing sense of anxiety at seeing his works exhibited for the first time, since he had always been notoriously insecure about his talents as an artist, and, in my opinion, had good reason to be. On the other hand, there might possibly have been a serious organic condition involved, I allowed when speaking with the nurse, and later with the doctor. In any case, Grossvogel had finally collapsed on the floor of the art gallery, and had been unable to do anything but groan somewhat pitifully, and, to be honest, somewhat irritatingly since that time. After listening to my account of Grossvogel's collapse, the doctor instructed the artist to lie down upon a gurney that stood at the end of a badly lighted hallway, while both the doctor and the nurse walked off in the opposite direction. I stood close by Grossvogel during the time that he lay upon this gurney in the shadows of that makeshift clinic. It was the middle of the night by then, and Grossvogel's moaning had abated somewhat, only to be replaced by what I understood at that time as a series of delirious utterances. In the course of this rhetorical delirium, the artist mentioned several times something that he called the pervasive shadow. I told him that it was merely the poor illumination of the hallway, my own words sounding somewhat delirious to me during the fatigue brought on by the events of that night, both at the art gallery and in the emergency room of that tawdry hospital. Afterward, I just stood there, listening to Grossvogel murmur in intervals, no longer responding to his delirious and increasingly elaborate utterances about the pervasive shadow that causes things to be what they would not be, or the all-moving darkness that makes things do what they would not do. After an hour or so of listening to Grossvogel, I noticed that the doctor and nurse were now standing close together at the other end of that dark hallway. They seemed to be conferring with each other for the longest time, and every so often one or both of them would look in the direction where I was standing, close by the prostrate and murmuring Grossvogel. I wondered how long they were going to carry on with what seemed to me a medical charade, a clinical dumb show, while the artist lay moaning and now more frequently murmuring on the subject of the shadow and the darkness. Perhaps I dozed off on my feet for a moment, because it seemed that, from out of nowhere, the nurse was suddenly at my side, and the doctor was no longer anywhere in sight. The nurse's white uniform now appeared almost luminous in the dingy shadows of that hallway. "You can go home now," she said to me. "Your friend is going to be admitted to the hospital." She then pushed Grossvogel on his gurney toward the doors of an elevator at the end of the hallway. As soon as she reached these elevator doors, they opened quickly and silently, pouring the brightest light into that dim hallway. When the doors were fully opened, I could see the doctor standing inside. He pulled Grossvogel's stretcher into the brilliantly illuminated elevator, while the nurse pushed the stretcher from behind. As soon as they were all inside, the elevator doors closed quickly and silently, and the hallway in which I was still standing seemed even darker and more dense with shadows than it had before. The following day I visited Grossvogel at the hospital. He had been placed in a small private room in a distant corner of the institution's uppermost floor. As I walked toward this room, looking for the number I had been given at the information desk downstairs, it seemed to me that none of the other rooms on that floor had any patients occupying them. It was only when I found the number I sought that I looked inside, and actually saw a bed that was occupied, conspicuously so, since Grossvogel was a rather large-bodied individual, who took up the full length and breadth of an old and sagging mattress. He seemed quite giant-like, lying on that undersized institutional mattress in that small, windowless room. There was barely enough space for me to squeeze myself between the wall and the bedside of the artist, who seemed to be still in much the same delirious condition as he had been the night before. There was no sign of recognition on his part that I was in the same room, although we were so close that I was practically on top of him. Even after I spoke his name several times, his teary gaze betrayed no notice of my presence. However, as I began to sidle away from his bedside, I was startled when Grossvogel firmly grabbed my arm with his enormous left hand, which was the hand he used for painting and drawing the works of his, which had been exhibited in the storefront art gallery the previous evening. "Grossvogel," I said expectantly, thinking that perhaps he was going to respond, if only to speak about the pervasive shadow that causes things to be what they would not be, and the all-moving darkness that causes things to do what they would not do. But a few seconds later his hand became limp, and fell from my arm onto the very edge of the misshapen institutional mattress, on which his body again lay still and unresponsive. After some moments I made my way out of Grossvogel's private room, and walked over to the nurse's station on the same floor of the hospital to inquire about the artist's medical condition. The sole nurse in attendance listened to my request, and consulted a folder with the name Rainer Grossvogel typed in one of its upper corners. After studying me some time longer than she had studied the pages concerning the artist, and now hospital patient, she simply said, "Your friend is being observed very closely." "Is that all you can tell me?" I asked. "His tests haven't been returned. You might ask about them later." "Later today?" "Yes, later today," she said, taking Grossvogel's folder and walking away into another room. I heard the squeaking sound of a drawer in an old filing cabinet being opened and then suddenly slammed shut again. For some reason I stood there waiting for the nurse to emerge from the room where she had taken Grossvogel's medical folder. Finally I gave up and returned home. When I called the hospital later that day, I was told that Grossvogel had been released. "He's gone home?" I said, which was the only thing that occurred to me to say. "We have no way of knowing where he's gone," the woman who answered the phone replied just before hanging up on me. Nor did anyone else know where Grossvogel had gone, for he was not at his home, and no one among our circle had any knowledge of his whereabouts. It was several weeks, perhaps more than a month, after Grossvogel's release from the hospital and apparent disappearance, that several of us had gathered, purely by chance, at the storefront art gallery where the artist had collapsed during the opening night of his first exhibit. By this time, even I had ceased to be concerned in any way with Grossvogel or the fact that he had, without warning, simply dropped out of sight. Certainly he was not the first to do so among our circle, all of whom were more or less unstable, sometimes dangerously volatile persons who might involve themselves in questionable activities for the sake of some artistic or intellectual vision, or simply out of pure desperation of spirit. I think that the only reason any of us mentioned Grossvogel's name as we drifted about the art gallery that afternoon was the fact that his works still remained on exhibit, and wherever we turned we were confronted by some painting or drawing of his which, in a pamphlet issued to accompany the show, I myself had written were manifestations of a singularly gifted artistic visionary, when in fact they were without exception quite run-of-the-mill specimens of the sort of artistic nonsense that, for reasons unknown to all concerned, will occasionally gain a measure of success, or even a high degree of prominence for their creator. "What am I supposed to do with all this junk?" complained the woman who owned, or perhaps only rented, the storefront building that had been set up as an art gallery. I was about to say to her that I would take responsibility for removing Grossvogel's works from the gallery, and perhaps even store them somewhere for a time, when the skeletal person, who always introduced himself as a defrocked academic, interjected, suggesting to the agitated owner, or at least operator, of the art gallery, that she should send them to the hospital where Grossvogel had supposedly been treated after his collapse. When I asked why he had used the word supposedly, he replied, "I've long believed that place to be a dubious institution, and I'm not the only one to hold this view." I then asked if there was any credible basis for this belief of his, but he only crossed his skeletal arms and looked at me, as if I had just insulted him in some way. "Mrs. Angela," he said to a woman who was standing nearby, studying one of Grossvogel's paintings as if she were seriously considering it for purchase. At that time, Mrs. Angela's psychic coffeehouse had yet to prove itself a failed venture, and possibly she was thinking that Grossvogel's works, although inferior from an artistic standpoint, might in some way complement the ambiance of her place of business, where patrons could sit at tables and receive advice from hired psychic counselors, while also feasting on an array of excellent pastries. "You should listen to what he says about that hospital," Mrs. Angela said to me, without taking her eyes off that painting of Grossvogel's. "I've had a strong feeling about that place for a long time. There is some aspect of it that is extremely devious." "Dubious," corrected the defrocked academic. "Yes," answered Mrs. Angela. "It's not by any means some place I'd like to wake up and find myself." "I wrote a poem about it," said the neatly dressed gentleman, who all this time had been marauding about the floor of the gallery, no doubt waiting for the most propitious moment to approach the woman who owned or rented the storefront building and persuade her to sponsor what he was forever touting as an evening of hermetic readings, which of course would prominently feature his own works. "I once read that poem to you," he said to the gallery owner. "Yes, you read it to me," she replied, with barely any vocal inflection. "I wrote it after being treated in the emergency room of that place very late one night," explained the poet. "What were you treated for?" I asked him. "Oh, nothing serious. I went home a few hours later. I was never admitted as a patient, I'm glad to say. It was, and I quote from my poem on the subject, the nucleus of the abysmal." "That's fine to say that," I said, "but could we possibly speak in more explicit terms?" However, before I could draw out a response from the self-styled writer of hermetic lyrics, the door of the art gallery was suddenly pushed open with a conspicuous force that all of us inside instantly recognized. A moment later, we saw standing before us the large-bodied figure of Rainer Grossvogel. Physically, he appeared to be, for the most part, much the same person I recalled prior to his collapse on the floor of the art gallery, not more than a few feet from where I was now standing, bearing none of the traits of that moaning, delirious creature whom I had taken in a taxi to the hospital for emergency treatment. Nevertheless, there did seem to be something different about him, a subtle but thorough change in the way he looked upon what lay before him. Whereas the gaze of the artist had once been characteristically downcast or nervously averted, his eyes now seemed completely direct in their focus and filled with a calm purpose. "I'm taking away all of this," he said, gesturing broadly but quite gently toward the artworks of his that filled the gallery, none of which had been sold either on the opening night of the show or during the subsequent period of his disappearance. "I would appreciate your assistance if you will give it," he added, as he began taking down paintings and drawings from along the walls. The rest of us joined him in this endeavor without question or comment, and laden with artworks both large and small, we followed him out of the gallery toward a battered pickup truck parked at the curb in front. Grossvogel casually hurled his works into the back of the rented, or possibly borrowed truck, since the artist had never been known to possess any kind of vehicle before that day, exhibiting no concern for the damage that might be incurred on what he had once considered the best examples of his artistic output to date. There was a moment's hesitation on the part of Mrs. Angela, who was perhaps still considering how one or more of these works would look in her place of business, but ultimately she too began carrying Grossvogel's works out of the gallery and hurling them into the back of the truck, where they piled up like refuse, until the gallery's walls and floor space were entirely cleared, and the place looked like any other disused storefront. Grossvogel then got into the truck, while the rest of us stood in wondering silence outside the emptied art gallery. Putting his head out the open window of the rented or borrowed truck, he called to the woman who ran the gallery. She walked over to the driver's side of the truck and exchanged a few words with the artist before he started the engine of the vehicle and drove off. Returning to where we had remained standing on the sidewalk, she announced to us that, a few weeks hence, there would be a second exhibit of Grossvogel's work at the gallery. This, then, was the message that was passed among the circle of persons with whom I was associated at the time, that Grossvogel, after physically collapsing from an undisclosed ailment or attack at the first, highly unsuccessful exhibit of his works, was now going to present a second exhibit after summarily cleaning out the art gallery of those rather worthless paintings and drawings of his, already displayed to the public, and hauling them away in the back of a pickup truck. Grossvogel's new exhibit was unusually well advertised by the woman who owned the art gallery, and who stood to gain financially from the sale of what, in a phrase used in the promotional copy for the event, were somewhat awkwardly called radical and revisionary works by the celebrated artistic visionary Rainer Grossvogel. Nevertheless, due to the circumstances surrounding both the artist's previous and upcoming exhibits, the whole thing almost immediately devolved into a fog of delirious and sometimes lurid gossip and speculation. This development was wholly in keeping with the nature of those who comprised that circle of dubious, not to mention devious, artistic and intellectual persons of which I had unexpectedly become a central figure. After all, it was I who had taken Grossvogel to the hospital following his collapse of the first exhibit of his works, and it was the hospital, already a subject of strange repute as I discovered, that loomed so prominently within the delirious fog of gossip and speculation surrounding Grossvogel's upcoming exhibit. There was even talk of some special procedures and medications to which the artist had been exposed during his brief confinement at this institution that would account for his unexplained disappearance and subsequent re-emergence in order to perpetrate what many presumed would be a startling artistic vision. No doubt it was this expectation, this desperate hope for something of brilliant novelty and lavishly colorful imagination, which in the minds of some overly excitable persons promised to exceed the domain of mere aesthetics and even extend the bounds of artistic expression, that led to the acceptance among our circle of the unorthodox nature of Grossvogel's new exhibit, as well as accounting for the emotional letdown that followed for those of us in attendance that opening night. And in fact, what occurred at the gallery that night in no way resembled the sort of exhibit we were accustomed to attending. The floor of the gallery and the gallery's walls remained as bare as the day when Grossvogel appeared with a pickup truck to cart off all his works from his old art show, while the new one, we soon discovered after arriving, was to take place in the small back room of the storefront building. Furthermore, we were charged a rather large fee in order to enter this small back room, which was illuminated by only a few light bulbs of extremely low wattage dangling here and there from the ceiling. One of the light bulbs was hung in a corner of the room, directly above a small table, which had a torn section of a bedsheet draped over it to conceal something that was bulging beneath it. Radiating out from this corner with its dim light bulb and small table were several loosely arranged rows of folding chairs. These uncomfortable chairs were eventually occupied by those of us, about a dozen in all, who were willing to pay the large fee for what seemed to be an event more in the style of a primitive stage show than anything resembling an art exhibit. I could hear Mrs. Angela in one of the seats behind me, saying over and over to those around her, "What the hell is this?" Finally, She leaned forward and said to me, "What does Grossvogel think he's doing? I've heard that he's been medicated to the eyeballs ever since his stay in that hospital." Yet the artist appeared lucid enough when a few moments later he made his way through the loosely arranged rows of folding chairs and stood beside the small table with the torn bedsheet draped over it and the low-watt light bulb dangling above. In the confines of the art gallery's back room, the large-bodied Grossvogel seemed almost gigantic, just as he had been when lying upon that institutional mattress in his private room at the hospital. Even his voice, which was usually quiet, even somewhat wispy, seemed to be enlarged when he began speaking to us. "Thank you all for coming here tonight," he began. "This shouldn't take very long. I have only a few things to say to you, and then something that I would like to show you. It's really no less than a miracle that I'm able to stand here and speak to you in this way. Not too long ago, as some of you may recall, I suffered a terrible attack in this very art gallery. I hope you won't mind if I tell you a few things about the nature of this attack and its consequences, things which I feel are essential to appreciating what I have to show you tonight. Well then, let me start by saying that, on one level, the attack I suffered in this art gallery, during the opening night of an exhibit of my works, was in the nature of a simple gastrointestinal upheaval, even if it was a quite severe episode of its type. For some time this gastrointestinal upheaval, the result of a disorder of my digestive system, had been making its progress within me. Over a period of many years this disorder had been progressively and insidiously developing, on one level, in the depths of my body, and on another level altogether, in the darkest aspect of my being. This period coincided with, and in fact was directly a consequence of, my involvement with the creation of artworks, my intense desire to make art, which is to say, my desire to do something, and my desire to be something, that is, an artist. I was attempting during this period I speak of, and for that matter throughout my entire life, to make something with my mind, specifically to create works of art by the only possible means I believed were available to me, which was by using my mind, or by using my imagination, or my creative faculties, some force or function of what people would call a soul, or a spirit, or simply a personal self. But when I found myself collapsed upon the floor of this art gallery, and later at the hospital, experiencing the most acute abdominal agony, I was overwhelmed by the realization that I had no mind or imagination that I could use, that there was nothing I could call a soul or self. Those things were all nonsense and dreams. I realized, in my severe gastrointestinal distress, that the only thing that had any existence at all was this larger-than-average physical body of mine. And I realized that there was nothing for this body to do except to function in physical pain, and there was nothing for it to be except for what it was, not an artist or creator of any kind, but solely a mass of flesh, a system of tissues and bones and so forth, suffering the agonies of a disorder of its digestive system, and that anything that did not directly stem from these facts, especially producing works of art, was profoundly and utterly false and unreal. At the same time, I also became aware of the force that was behind my intense desire to do something and to be something, particularly my desire to create utterly false and unreal works of art. In other words, I became aware of what in reality was activating my body. This realization was not made with my mind or imagination, and certainly it was not made through any such medium as my soul or self, all which are entirely nonsense and dreams. This realization of what was activating my body and its desires was made by the only means possible, this being by way of the human body itself and its organs of physical sensation. This is precisely how the world of non-human bodies has always functioned, and functions so much more successfully than the world of human bodies, which is forever obstructed by all the nonsense we fabricate about having minds and having souls or selves. The world of non-human bodies is activated directly in accord with the commands of that terrible force underlying all existence, which issues only a few simple desires, none of which have to do with anything as nonsensical and dreamlike as creating works of art, or of being an artist, of doing or being anything like these profoundly false and unreal things. Thus the world of non-human bodies never need suffer the pains of pursuing false and unreal desires, because such feelings have no relevance for those bodies, and never arise within them. Before continuing with the introductory talk that comprised the first part of his art exhibit, or artistic stage show as I thought of it, Grossvogel paused and for a moment seemed to be surveying the faces of the small audience seated in the back room of the gallery. What he had expressed to us concerning his body and its digestive malfunctions was on the whole comprehensible enough, even if certain points he was articulating seemed at the time to be questionable and his overall discourse somewhat unengaging. Yet we put up with Grossvogel's words, I believe, because we had thought that they were leading us into another, possibly more engaging phase of his experience, which somehow we already sensed was not wholly alienated from our own, whether or not we identified with its peculiarly gastrointestinal nature. Therefore we remained silent, almost respectfully so, considering the unorthodox proceedings of that night, as Grossvogel continued with what he had to tell us before the moment came when he unveiled what he had brought to show us. "It is all so very, very simple," the artist continued. "Our bodies are but one manifestation of the energy, the activating force that sets in motion all the objects, all the bodies of this world, and enables them to exist as they do. This activating force is something like a shadow that is not on the outside of all the bodies of this world, but is inside of everything and thoroughly pervades everything, an all-moving darkness that has no substance in itself, but that moves all the objects of this world, including those objects which we call our bodies. While I was in the throes of my gastrointestinal episode at the hospital, where I was treated, I descended, so to speak, to that deep abyss of entity, where I could feel how this shadow, this darkness, was activating my body. I could also hear its movement, not only within my body, but in everything around me, because the sound that made it was not the sound of my body. It was the sound of this shadow, this darkness, which is not like any other sound. Likewise, I was able to detect the workings of this pervasive and all-moving force through the sense of smell and the sense of taste, as well as the sense of touch with which my body is equipped. Finally, I opened my eyes, for throughout much of this agonizing ordeal of my digestive system, my eyelids were clenched shut in pain. And when I opened my eyes, I found that I could see how everything around me, including my own body, was activated from within by this pervasive shadow, this all-moving darkness. And nothing looked as I had always known it to look. Before that night, I had never experienced this world purely by means of my organs of physical sensation, which are the direct point of contact with that deep abyss of entity that I am calling the shadow, the darkness. My false and unreal works as an artist were merely the evidence of what I concocted with my mind or my imagination, which are basically nonsensical and dreamlike fabrications that only interfere with the workings of our senses. I believe that somehow these works of art reflected in some way the nature of myself, or my soul, when in actuality they only reflected my deranged and useless desires to do something and to be something, which always means to do and to be something false and unreal. Like everything else, these desires had been activated by the same pervasive shadow, the all-moving darkness, which, due to the self-annihilating agony of my gastrointestinal distress, I could now experience directly by means of my sense organs, and without the interference of my imaginary mind or my imaginary self. I should confess that prior to my physical collapse at this very art gallery, I had undergone a psychic collapse, a collapse of something false and unreal, of something nonsensical and dreamlike, it goes without saying, although it was all very genuine and real to me at the time. This collapse of my mind and myself was the result of how poorly my works of art were being received by those attending the opening night of my first exhibit, of how profoundly unsuccessful they were as artistic creations, miserably unsuccessful, even in the sphere of false and unreal artistic creations. This unsuccessful exhibit demonstrated to me how thoroughly I had failed in my efforts to be an artist. Everyone at the exhibit could see how unsuccessful my artworks proved to be, and I could see everyone in the very act of witnessing my unmitigated failure as an artist. This was the psychic crisis which precipitated my physical crisis and the eventual collapse of my body into spasms of gastrointestinal torment. Once my body and my personal sense of self had broken down, all that was left in operation were my organs of physical sensation, by means of which I was able to, for the first time, to experience directly that deep abyss of entity that is the shadow, the darkness, which had activated my intense desire to be a success at doing something, and it being something, and thereby also activated my body as it moved within this world, just as all bodies are likewise activated. And what I experienced through direct sensory channels, the spectacle of the shadow inside everything, the all-moving darkness, was so appalling that I was sure I would cease to exist. In some way, because of the manner in which my senses were now functioning, especially my visual sense, I did in fact cease to exist as I had existed before that night. Without the interference of my mind and my imagination, all that nonsensical dreaming about my soul and myself, I was forced to see things under the aspect of the shadow inside them, the darkness which activated them. And it was wholly appalling, more so than my words could possibly tell you. Nevertheless, Grossvogel went on to explain in detail to those of us who had paid the exorbitant price to see his stage show exhibit the appalling way in which he was forced to see the world around him, including his own body in its gastrointestinal distress, and how convinced he was that this vision of things would soon be the cause of his death, despite the measures taken to save him during his hospital sojourn. It was Grossvogel's contention that his only hope of survival was for him to perish completely, in the sense that the person, or the mind or self, that had once been Grossvogel would actually cease to exist. This necessary condition for survival, he maintained, prompted his physical body to undergo a metamorphic recovery. Within a matter of hours, Grossvogel told us, he no longer suffered from the symptoms of acute abdominal pains which had initiated his crisis. And furthermore, he was now able to tolerate the way in which he was permanently forced to see things, as he put it, under the aspect of the shadow inside them, the darkness which activated them. Since the person who had been Grossvogel had perished, as Grossvogel explained to us, the body of Grossvogel was able to continue as a successful organism, untroubled by the imaginary torments that had once been inflicted upon him by his fabricated mind and his false and unreal self. As he put it in his own words, I am no longer occupied with myself or my mind. What we in the audience now saw before us, he said, was Grossvogel's body speaking with Grossvogel's voice and using Grossvogel's neurological circuitry, but without the interference of the imaginary character known as Grossvogel. All of his words and actions, he said, now emanated directly from that same force which activates every one of us, if we could only realize it in the way he had been compelled to do in order to keep his body alive. The artist emphasized in his own terribly calm way that in no sense had he chosen his unique course of recovery. No one would willingly choose such a thing, he contended. Everyone prefers to continue their existence as a mind and a self, no matter what pain it causes them, no matter how false and unreal they might be, than to face the quite obvious reality of being only a body set in motion by this mindless, soulless, and selfless force, which he designated the shadow, the darkness. Nonetheless, Grossvogel disclosed to us this was exactly the reality that he needed to admit into his system if his body was to continue its existence and to succeed as an organism. It was purely a matter of physical survival, he said. Everybody should be able to understand that. Anyone would do the same. Moreover, the famous metamorphic recovery in which Grossvogel the person died and Grossvogel the body survived was so successful, he informed his stage show audience, that he immediately embarked upon a strenuous period of travel, mostly by means of inexpensive bus lines that took him great distances across and around the entire country, so that he could look at various people and places while exercising his new faculty of being able to see the shadow that pervaded them, the all-moving darkness that activated them, since he was no longer subject to the misconceptions about the world that are created by the mind or imagination, those obstructing mechanisms which were now removed from his system, and nor did he mistakenly imagine anyone or anything to possess a soul or a self. And everywhere he went he witnessed the spectacle that had previously so appalled him to the point of becoming a life-threatening medical condition. I could now know the world directly through the senses of my body, Grossvogel continued, and I saw with my body what I could never have seen with my mind or imagination during my career as a failed artist. Everywhere I traveled, I saw how the pervasive shadow, the all-moving darkness, was using our world. Because this shadow, this darkness, has nothing of its own, no way to exist except as an activating force or energy, whereas we have our bodies, we are only our bodies, whether they are organic bodies or non-organic bodies, human or non-human bodies, makes no difference. They are all simply bodies, and nothing but bodies, with no component whatever of the mind, or a self, or a soul. Hence the shadow, the darkness, uses our world for what it needs to thrive upon. It has nothing except its activating energy, while we are nothing except our bodies. This is why the shadow, the darkness, causes things to be what they would not be, and to do what they would not do. Because without the shadow inside them, the all-moving blackness activating them, they would be only what they are, heaps of matter, lacking any impulse, any urge to flourish, to succeed in this world. This state of affairs should be called what it is, an absolute nightmare. That is exactly what I experienced in the hospital when I realized, due to my intense gastrointestinal suffering, that I had no mind or imagination, no soul or self, that these were nonsensical and dreamlike intermediaries fabricated to protect human beings from realizing what it is we really are, only a collection of bodies activated by the shadow, the darkness. Those among us who are successful organisms to any degree, including artists, are so only by the virtue of the extent to which we function as bodies, and by no means as minds or selves. This is exactly the manner in which I had failed so exceptionally, since I was profoundly convinced of the existence of my mind and of my imagination, my soul and myself. My only hope lay in my ability to make a metamorphic recovery, to accept in every way the nightmarish order of things, so that I could continue to exist as a successful organism, even without the protective nonsense of the mind and the imagination, the protective dream of having any kind of soul or self. Otherwise I would have been annihilated by a fatally traumatic insanity brought on by the shock of the shattering realization. Therefore the person who was Grossvogel had to perish in that hospital, and good riddance, so that the body of Grossvogel could be free of its gastrointestinal crisis and go on to travel in all directions by various means of transportation, primarily the inexpensive transportation provided by interstate bus lines, witnessing the spectacle of the shadow, the darkness, using our world of bodies for what it needs to thrive upon. And after witnessing this spectacle, it was inevitable that I should portray it in some form, not as an artist who has failed, because he is using some nonsense called the mind or the imagination, but as a body that has succeeded in perceiving how everything in the world actually functions. That is what I have come to show you, to exhibit to you this evening. I, who had been lulled or agitated by Grossvogel's discourse as much as anyone in the audience, was for some reason surprised, and even apprehensive, when he suddenly ended his lecture, or fantasy monologue, or whatever I construed his words to be at the time. It seemed that he could have gone on speaking forever in the back room of that art gallery, where low-watt light bulbs hung down from the ceiling, one of them directly above the table that was covered with a torn section of bedsheet. And now Grossvogel was lifting one corner of the torn bedsheet to show us, at last, what he had created, not by using his mind or imagination, which he claimed no longer existed in him any more than did his soul or self, but by using only his body's organs of physical sensation. When he finally uncovered the piece completely, and it was fully displayed in the dull glow of the light bulb which hung directly above it, none of us demonstrated either a positive or negative reaction to it at first, possibly because our minds were so numbed by all the verbal build-up that had led to this moment of unveiling. It appeared to be a sculpture of some kind. However, I found it initially impossible to give this object any generic designation, either artistic or non-artistic. It might have been anything. The surface of the piece was uniformly of a shining darkness, having a glossy sheen beneath which was spread a swirling murk of shades that almost seemed to be in motion, an effect which seemed quite credibly the result of some swaying of the light bulb dangling above. There appeared to be a resemblance in its general outline to some kind of creature, perhaps a grossly distorted version of a scorpion or crab, since it displayed more than a few claw-like extensions reaching out from a central, highly shapeless mass. But it also appeared to have elements poking upward, peaks or horns that jutted at roughly vertical angles, and ended sometimes in a sharp point, and sometimes in a soft, head-like bulge. Because Grossvogel had spoken so much about bodies, it was natural to see such forms, in some deranged fashion, as the basis of the object, or as being incorporated into it somehow. A chaotic world of bodies of every kind, of shapes activated by the shadow inside them, the darkness that caused them to be what they would not be, and to do what they would not do. And among these body-like shapes, I recognized distinctly the large-bodied figure of the artist himself, although the significance of the fact that Grossvogel had implanted himself therein escaped me as I sat contemplating this modest exhibit. Whatever Grossvogel's sculpture may have represented in its parts or as a whole, it contained more than a suggestion of that absolute nightmare, which the artist, so to speak, had elucidated during his lecture or fantasy monologue earlier that evening. Yet this quality of the piece, even for an audience that had more than a slight appreciation of nightmarish subjects and contours, was not enough to offset the high price we had been required to pay for the privilege of hearing about Grossvogel's gastrointestinal ordeal and self-proclaimed metamorphic recovery. Soon after the artist unveiled his work to us, each of our bodies rose out of those uncomfortable folding chairs, and excuses for departing the premises were being spoken on all sides. Before making my own exit, I noticed that inconspicuously displayed next to Grossvogel's sculpture was a small card upon which was printed the title of the piece. Salal Number 1, it read. Later I learned something about the meaning of this term, which in the way of words both illuminated and concealed the nature of the thing that it named. The matter of Grossvogel's sculpture, he subsequently put out a series of several hundred, each of them with the same title followed by a number that placed it in a sequence of artistic production, was discussed at length as we sat waiting in the diner situated on the main street of the dead town of Crampton. The gentleman seated to my left, at one of the few tables in the diner, reiterated his accusations against Grossvogel. "First, he subjected us to an artistic swindle," said this person, who was prone to sudden and protracted coughing spells. "And now he has subjected us to a metaphysical swindle. It was unheard of, charging us such a price for that exhibition of his, and now charging us so outrageously, once again, for this physical, metaphysical excursion. We've all been taken in by that." "That absolute fraud," said Mrs. Angela, when the man on my left was unable to complete his statement because he had broken into another fit of coughing. "I don't think he's even going to show up," she continued. "He induces us to come to this hole-in-the-wall town. He says that this is the place where we need to gather for this excursion of his. But he doesn't show his face anywhere around here. Where did he find this place? On one of those bus tours he was always talking about?" It seemed that we had only ourselves and our own idiocy to blame for the situation we were in. Even though no one openly admitted it, the truth was that those of us who were present had been very much impressed with Grossvogel on the day when he entered the art gallery, and had us assist him in throwing all of his works on exhibit into the back of a battered pickup truck. None of us in our small circle of artists and intellectuals had ever done anything remotely like that, or even dreamed of doing something so drastic and full of drama. From that day it became our unspoken conviction that Grossvogel was onto something, and our disgraceful secret that we desired to attach ourselves to him in order to profit in some way by our association with him. At the same time, of course, we also resented Grossvogel's daring behavior, and were perfectly ready to welcome another failure on his part, perhaps even another collapse on the floor of the gallery, where he and his artworks had already once failed to everyone's thorough satisfaction. Such a confusion of motives was more than enough reason for us to pay the exorbitant fee that Grossvogel charged for his new exhibit, which we afterward dismissed in one way or another. Following the show that night, I stood on the sidewalk outside the art gallery, listening once again to Mrs. Angela's implications regarding the true source of Grossvogel's metamorphic recovery and artistic inspiration. "Mr. Reiner Grossvogel has been medicated to the eyeballs ever since he came out of that hospital," she said to me, as if for the first time. "I know one of the girls who works at the drugstore that fills his prescriptions. She's a very good customer of mine," she added, her wrinkled and heavily made-up eyes flashing with self-satisfaction. Then she continued her scandalous revelations. "I think you might know the kind of medications prescribed for someone with Grossvogel's medical condition, which really isn't a medical condition at all, but a psychophysical disorder that I or any of the people who work for me could have told him about a long time ago. Grossvogel's brain has been swimming in all kinds of tranquilizers and antidepressants for months now, and not only that, he's also been taking an antispasmodic compound for that condition of his that he's supposed to have recovered from by such miraculous means. I'm not surprised he doesn't think he has a mind or any kind of self, which is all just an act in any case." "Antispasmodic," Mrs. Angela hissed at me as we stood on the sidewalk outside the art gallery following Grossvogel's exhibit. "Do you know what that means?" she asked me, and then quickly answered her own question. It means belladonna, a poisonous hallucinogenic. It means phenobarbital, a barbiturate. The girl from the drugstore told me all about it. He's been overdosing himself on all these drugs. Do you understand? That's why he's been seeing things in that peculiar way that he would have us believe. It's not some shadow or whatever he says that's activating his body. I would know about something like that, now wouldn't I? I have a special gift that provides me with insight into things like that. But despite her gifts, along with her excellent pastries, Mrs. Angela's psychic coffeehouse did not thrive as a business and ultimately went under altogether. On the other hand, Grossvogel's sculptures, which he produced at a prolific pace, were an incredible success, both among local buyers of artistic products and among art merchants and collectors across the country, even reaching an international market to some extent. Rainer Grossvogel was also celebrated in feature articles that appeared in major art magazines and non-artistic publications alike, although he was usually portrayed, in the words of one critic, as a one-man artistic and philosophical freak show. Nevertheless, Grossvogel was by any measure now functioning as a highly successful organism, and it was due to this success, which had never been approached by anyone else within our small circle of artists and intellectuals, that those of us who had abandoned Grossvogel upon hearing him lecture on his metamorphic recovery from a severe gastrointestinal disorder, and viewing the first in his prodigious Salal series of sculptures, now once again attached ourselves and our failed careers to him, and his unarguably successful body without a mind or a self. Even Mrs. Angela eventually became conversant with the realizations that Grossvogel had first espoused in the back room of that storefront art gallery, and now disseminated in what seemed an unending line of philosophical pamphlets, which became almost as sought after by collectors as his series of Salal sculptures. Thus, when Grossvogel issued a certain brochure among the small circle of artists and intellectuals which he had never abandoned even after he achieved such amazing financial success and celebrity, a brochure announcing a physical, metaphysical excursion to the dead town of Crampton, we were more than willing once more to pay the exorbitant price he was asking. This was the brochure to which I referred the others seated at the table with me in the Crampton diner. The photographic portraitist who was subject to coughing jags on my left, the author of the unpublished philosophical treatise An Investigation into the Conspiracy Against the Human Race on my right, and Mrs. Angela directly across from me. The man on my left was still reiterating, with prolonged interruptions of his coughing which I will here delete, the charge that Grossvogel had perpetrated a metaphysical swindle with his high-priced physical-metaphysical excursion. All of Grossvogel's talk about that business with the shadow and the blackness and the nightmare world he purportedly was seeing. And then where do we end up? In some godforsaken town that went out of business a long time ago, and in some part of the country where everything looks like an overexposed photograph. I have my camera with me, ready to create portraits of faces that have looked upon Grossvogel's shadowy blackness, or whatever he was planning for us to do here. I've even thought of several very good titles and concepts for these photographic portraits, which I imagine would have a good chance of being published together as a book, or at least a portfolio in a leading photography magazine. I thought that at the very least I might have taken back with me a series of photographic portraits of Grossvogel, with that huge face of his. I could have placed that with almost any of the better art magazines. But where is the celebrated Grossvogel? He said he would be here to meet us. He said we would find out everything about that shadow business as I understood him. Furthermore, I have my head prepared for those absolute nightmares that Grossvogel prattled on about in his pamphlets and in that highly deceptive brochure of his. This brochure, I said, during one of the man's more raucous intervals of hacking, makes no explicit promises about any of those things you've imagined to be contained there. It specifically announced that this is to be an excursion, and I quote, to a dead town, a finished town, a failed town, a false and unreal setting that is the product of unsuccessful organisms, and therefore a town that is exemplary of that extreme state of failure that may so distress human organic systems, particularly the gastrointestinal system, to the point of weakening its delusional and totally fabricated defenses, e.g. the mind, the self, and thus precipitating a crisis of nightmare realization involving And I think we're all familiar with the shadow and darkness talk which follows. The point is, Grossvogel promises nothing in this brochure except an environment redolent of failure, a sort of hothouse for failed organisms. The rest of it is entirely born of your own imaginations, and my own, I might add. Well, said Mrs. Angela, pulling the brochure I had placed on the table toward her, did I imagine reading that, and I quote, suitable dining accommodations will be provided? Bitter coffee and stale donuts are not what I consider suitable. Grossvogel is now a rich man, as everybody knows, and this is the best he can do? Until the day I closed down my business for good, I served superlative coffee, not to mention superlative pastries, even if I now admit that I didn't make them myself. And my psychic readings, mine and those of all my people, were as breathtaking as they come. Meanwhile, the rich man and that waitress there are practically poisoning us with this bitter coffee and these incredibly stale cut-rate donuts. What I could use at this moment is some of that anti-spasmodic medicine Grossvogel's been taking in such liberal doses for so long. And I'm sure he'll have plenty of it with him if he ever shows his face around here, which I doubt he will after making us sick with his suitable dining accommodations. If you'll excuse me for a moment. As Miss Angela made her way toward the lavatory on the other side of the diner, I noticed that there were already a few others lined up outside the single door labeled Restroom. I glanced around at those still seated at the few tables or upon the stools along the counter of the diner, and there seemed to be a number of persons who were holding their hands upon their stomachs, some of them tenderly massaging their abdominal region. I, too, was beginning to feel some intestinal discomfort, which might have been attributable to the poor quality of the coffee and donuts we had been served by our waitress, who now appeared to be nowhere in sight. The man sitting on my left had also excused himself and made his way across the diner. Just as I was about to get up from the table and join him, and the others who were lining up outside the restroom, the man seated on my right began telling me about his researches and his speculations, which formed the basis for his unpublished philosophical treatise, An Investigation into the Conspiracy against the Human Race, and how these related to his intense suspicions concerning Grossvogel. I should have known better than to have entered into this excursion, the man said, but I felt I needed to know more about what was behind Grossvogel's story. I was intensely suspicious with respect to his assertions and claims about his metamorphic recovery and about so many other things. For instance, his assertion, his realization, as he calls it, that the mind and the imagination, the soul and the self are all simply nonsense and dreams. And yet he contends that what he calls the shadow, the darkness, the salal, as his artworks are entitled, is not nonsense and dreams, and that it uses our bodies, as he claims, for what it needs to thrive upon. Well, really, what is his basis for dismissing his mind and imagination and so forth, but embracing the reality of his salal, which seems no less the product of some nonsensical dream? I found the man's suspicious interrogations to be a welcome distraction from the intestinal pressure now building up inside me. In response to his question, I said that I could only reiterate Grossvogel's explanation, that he was no longer experiencing things, that is, no longer seeing things with his supposedly illusory mind and self, but with his body, which as he further contended was activated and entirely occupied by the shadow that is the salal. This isn't by any means the most preposterous revelation of its kind, at least in my experience, I said, in defense of Grossvogel. Nor is it in mine, he said. Besides, I continued, Grossvogel's curiously named sculptures, in my opinion, have a merit and interest apart from a strictly metaphysical context and foundation. Do you know the significance of this word salal that he uses as the sole title for all his artworks? No, I'm afraid I have no notion of its origin or meaning, I regretfully confessed. But I suppose you will enlighten me? Enlightenment has nothing to do with this word, which is ancient Hebrew. It means to become darkened, to become enshadowed, so to speak. This term has emerged not infrequently in the course of my researches for my treatise, An Investigation into the Conspiracy against the Human Race. It occurs, of course, in numerous passages throughout the Old Testament, that potboiler of apocalypses, both major and minor. Maybe so, I said. But I don't agree that Grossvogel's use of a term from Hebrew mythology necessarily calls into question the sincerity of his assertions, or even their validity if you want to take it that far. Yes, well, I seem not to be making myself clear to you. What I'm referring to emerged quite early in my researches and preliminary speculations for my investigation. Briefly, I would simply say that it's not my intention to cast doubt on Grossvogel's Salal. My investigation would prove me to be quite explicit and unequivocal on this phenomenon, although I would never employ the rather showy and somewhat trivial approach that Grossvogel has taken, which to some extent could account for the fabulous success of his sculptures and pamphlets, on the one hand, and on the other, the abysmal failure of my treatise, which will remain forever unpublished and unread. All that aside, my point is not that this Salal of Grossvogel's isn't in some way an actual phenomenon. I know only too well that the mind and the imagination, the soul and the self, are not only the nonsensical dreams that Grossvogel makes them out to be. They are in fact no more than a cover-up, as false and unreal as the artwork Grossvogel was producing before his medical ordeal and recovery. Grossvogel was able to penetrate this fact by some extremely rare circumstance which no doubt had something to do with his medical ordeal. His gastrointestinal disorder, I said, feeling more and more the symptoms of this malady in my own body. Exactly. It's the precise mechanics of this experience of his that interest me enough to invest in this excursion. This is what remains so obscure. There is nothing obvious, if I may say, about his Salal or its mechanism, yet Grossvogel is making what to my mind are some fascinating claims and distinctions with such overwhelming certitude. But he is certainly mistaken, or possibly being devious, on one point at least. I say this because I know he has not been entirely forthcoming about the hospital where he was treated. In the research pertaining to my investigation, I have looked into such places and how they operate. I know for a fact that the hospital where Grossvogel was treated is an extremely rotten institution, an absolutely rotten institution. Everything about it is a sham and a cover-up for the most gruesome goings-on, the true extent of which I'm not sure even those involved with such places realize. It's not a matter of any sort of depravity, so to speak, or of malign intent. There simply develops a sort of collusion, a rotten alliance on the part of certain people and places. They are in league with, well, if you could only read my investigation, you would know the sort of nightmare that Grossvogel was faced with in that hospital, a place reeking of nightmares. Only in such a place could Grossvogel have confronted those nightmarish realizations he has discoursed upon in his countless pamphlets and portrayed in his series of Salal sculptures, which he says were not the product of his mind or imagination, or his soul or his self, but only the product of what he was seeing with his body and its organs of physical sensation, the shadow, the darkness. The mind and all that, the self and all that, are only a cover-up, only a fabrication, as Grossvogel says. They are that which cannot be seen with the body, which cannot be sensed by any organ of physical sensation. This is because they are actually non-existent cover-ups, masks, disguises for the thing that is activating our bodies in the way Grossvogel explained, activating them and using them for what it needs to thrive upon. They are the artworks, in fact, of the Salal itself. Oh, it's impossible to simply tell you. I wish you could read my investigation. It would have explained everything. It would have revealed everything. But how could you read what was never written in the first place? Never written? I inquired. Why was it never written? Why? He said, pausing for a moment and grimacing in pain. The answer to that is exactly what Grossvogel has been preaching in both his pamphlets and his public appearances. His entire doctrine, if it can even be called that, if there ever could be such a thing in any sense whatever, is based on the non-existence, the imaginary nature of everything we believe ourselves to be. Despite his efforts to express what has happened to him, he must know very well that there are no words that are able to explain such a thing. Words are a total obfuscation of the most basic fact of existence, the very conspiracy against the human race that my treatise might have illuminated. Grossvogel has experienced the essence of this conspiracy firsthand, or at least has claimed to experience it. Words are simply a cover-up for this conspiracy. They are the ultimate means for the cover-up, the ultimate artwork of the shadow, the darkness, its ultimate artistic cover-up. Because of the existence of words, we think that there exists a mind, that some kind of soul or self exists. This is just another of the infinite layers of the cover-up. There is no mind that could have written an investigation into the conspiracy against the human race. No mind that could write such a book, and no mind that could read such a book. There is no one at all who can say anything about this most basic fact of existence, no one who can betray this reality, and there is no one to whom it could ever be conveyed. That all seems impossible to comprehend, I objected. It just might be, if only there actually were anything to comprehend, or anyone to comprehend it, but there are no such beings. If that's the case, I said, wincing with abdominal discomfort, then who is having this conversation? Who indeed, he answered. Nevertheless, I would like to continue speaking. Even if this is only nonsense and dreams, I feel the need to perpetuate it all, especially at this moment, when this pain is taking over my mind and myself. Pretty soon, none of this will make any difference. No, he said in a dead voice. It doesn't matter now. I noticed that he had been staring out the front window of the diner for some time, gazing at the town. Some of the others in the diner were doing the same, dumbstruck at what they saw and agonized, as I was, by the means by which they were seeing it. The vacant scene of the town's empty streets, and the desolate season that had presided over the surrounding landscape, that place we had complained was absent of any manifestations of interest when we first arrived there, was undergoing a visible metamorphosis to the eyes of many of us, as though an eclipse were occurring. But what we were now seeing was not a darkness descending from far skies, but a shadow which was arising from within the dead town around us, as if a torrent of black blood had begun roaring through its pale body. I realized that I had suddenly and unknowingly joined in the forefront of those who were affected by the changes taking place, even though I literally had no idea what was happening, no knowledge that came to my mind, which had ceased to function in the way it had only moments before, leaving my body in a dumb state of agony, its organs of sensation registering the gruesome spectacle of things around me. Other bodies eclipsed by the shadow swirling inside their skins, some of them still speaking as though they were persons who possessed a mind and a self, imaginary entities still complaining in human words about the pain they were only beginning to realize, crying out for remedies as they entered the nucleus of the abysmal, and still seeing with their minds, even up to the very moment when their minds abandoned them entirely, dissipating like a mirage, able to say only how everything appeared to their minds, how the shapes of the town outside the windows of the diner were turning all crooked and crabbed, reaching out toward them as with claws, and rising up like strange peaks and horns into the sky, no longer pale and gray, but swirling with the pervasive shadow, the all-moving darkness that they could finally see so perfectly, because now they were seeing with their bodies, only with their bodies, pitched into a great black pain. And one voice called out, a voice that both moaned and coughed, that there was a face outside, a face across the entire sky, it said. The sky and town were now both so dark that perhaps only someone preoccupied with the photographic portraiture of the human face could have seen such a thing among that world of churning shadows outside the windows of the diner. Soon after that the words all but ceased, because bodies in true pain do not speak. The very last words I remember were those of a woman who screamed for someone to take her to a hospital. And this was a request which, in the strangest way, had been anticipated by the one who had induced us into making this physical metaphysical excursion, and whose body had already mastered what our bodies were only beginning to learn, the nightmare of a body that is being used and that knows what is using it, making things be what they would not be and do what they would not do. I sensed the presence of a young woman who had worn a uniform as white as gauze. She had returned, and there were others like her who moved among us, and who knew how to minister to our pains in order to effect our metamorphic recovery. We did not need to be brought to their hospital, since the hospital and all its rottenness had been brought to us. And as much as I would like to say everything that happened to us in the town of Crampton, whose deadness and desolation seem an illusion of paradise after having its hidden life revealed to our eyes, as much as I would like to say how it was that we were conveyed from that region of the country, that nucleus of nowhere, and returned to our distant homes, as much as I would like to say precisely what assistance and treatments we might have received that delivered us from that place and the pain we experienced there, I cannot say anything about it at all. Because when one is saved from such agony, the most difficult thing in the world is to question the means of salvation. The body does not know or care what takes away its pain, and is incapable of questioning these things. For that is what we have become, or what we have all but become. Bodies without the illusion of minds or imaginations, bodies without the distractions of souls or selves. None of us among our circle question this fact, although we have never spoken of it since our recovery. Nor have we spoken of the absence of Grossvogel from our circle, which does not exist in the way it once did, that is to say, as an assemblage of artists and intellectuals. We became the recipients of what someone designated the legacy of Grossvogel, which was more than a metaphorical expression, since the artist had in fact bequeathed to each of us, on the condition of his death or disappearance for a stipulated period of time, a share in the considerable earnings he had amassed from the sales of his works. But this strictly monetary inheritance was only the beginning of the success that all of us from that abolished circle of artists and intellectuals began to experience, the seed from which we began to grow out of our existence as failed minds and selves into our new lives as highly successful organisms, each in our own field of endeavor. Of course, we could not have failed, even if we tried, in attaining whatever end we pursued, since everything we have experienced and created was a phenomenon of the shadow, the darkness, which reached outward and reached upward from inside us to claw and poke its way to the heights of a mountainous pile of human and non-human bodies. These are all we have and all we are. These are what is used and thrived upon. I can feel my own body being used and cultivated, the desires and impulses that are pulling it to succeed, that are tugging it toward every kind of success. There is no means by which I could ever oppose these desires and impulses, now that I exist solely as a body which seeks only its efficient perpetuation so that it may be thrived upon by what needs it. There is no possibility of my resisting what needs to thrive upon us, no possibility of betraying it in any way. Even if this little account of mine, this little chronicle, seems to disclose secrets that might undermine the nightmarish order of things, it does nothing but support and promulgate that order. Nothing can resist or betray this nightmare, because nothing exists that might do anything, that might be anything, that could realize a success in that way. The very idea of such a thing is only nonsense and dreams. There could never be anything written about the conspiracy against the human race, because the phenomenon of a conspiracy requires a multiplicity of agents, a division of sides, one of which is undermining the other in some way, and the other having an existence that is able to be undermined. But there is no such multiplicity or division, no undermining or resistance or betrayal on either side. What exists is only this pulling, this tugging upon all of the bodies of this world. But these bodies have a collective existence only in a taxonomic or perhaps a topographical sense, and in no way constitute a collective entity, an agency that might be the object of a conspiracy. And a collective entity called the human race cannot exist where there is only a collection of non-entities, of bodies which are themselves only provisional, and will be lost one by one, the whole collection of them always approaching nonsense, always dissolving into dreams. There can be no conspiracy in a void, or rather in a black abyss. There can only be this tugging of all these bodies toward that ultimate success, which it seems my large-bodied friend realized when he was finally used to the fullest extent, and his body used up, entirely consumed by what needed it to thrive. There is only one true and final success for the shadow that makes things what they would not be, Grossvogel proclaimed, in the very last of his pamphlets. There is only one true and final success for the all-moving blackness that makes things do what they would not do, he wrote. And these were the very last lines of that pamphlet. Grossvogel could not explain himself or anything else beyond these inconclusive statements. He had run out of the words that, to quote someone who shall remain as nameless as only a member of the human race can be, are the ultimate artwork of the shadow, the darkness, its ultimate artistic cover-up. Just as he could not resist it as his body was pulled toward that ultimate success, he could not betray it with his words. It was during the winter following the Crampton excursion that I began fully to see where these last words of Grossvogel were leading. Late one night I stood gazing from a window as the first snow of the season began to fall, and become increasingly prolific throughout each dark hour that I observed its progress with my organs of physical sensation. By that time I could see what was inside the falling flakes of snow, just as I could see what was inside all other things, activating them with its force. And what I saw was a black snow falling from a black sky. There was nothing recognizable in that sky, certainly no familiar visage spread out across the night and implanted into it. There was only this blackness above, and this blackness below. There was only this consuming, proliferating blackness, whose only true and final success was in merely perpetuating itself as successfully as it could in a world where nothing exists that could ever hope to be anything else except what it needs to thrive upon. Until everything is entirely consumed, and there is only one thing remaining in all existence, and it is an infinite body of blackness, activating itself and thriving upon itself with eternal success in the deepest abyss of entity. Grossvogel could not resist or portray it, even if it was an absolute nightmare, the ultimate physical metaphysical nightmare. He ceased to be a person so that he could remain a successful organism. Anyone would do the same, he said. And no matter what I say, I cannot resist or betray it. No one could do so because there is no one here. There is only this body, this shadow, this darkness.